Hello and welcome to True Love, No Shame, a podcast on recovering from Christian purity culture. I'm Danny Fankhauser, author of Shameless, How I Lost My Virginity and Kept My Faith. You can learn more about my book at shamelessthebook.com. I'm here today with pastor and author Bromleigh McCleneghan, who wrote Good Christian Sex, Why Chastity Isn't the Only Option, and Other Things the Bible Says About Sex. So Bromleigh, I love the title because it makes it very clear what the book is about. This was an issue I thought about for years and, would read Christian books that were about sex or relationships and was just kind of like waiting for someone to come out and say it's not that big of a deal. You can have sex before you're married. And no one has said it in a book. And this title makes it very clear that's what the book is about. So what I wanted to start with is you actually didn't grow up hearing that waiting till marriage was the only way. So can you tell me a little bit more about how your denomination was different than sort of like this evangelical denomination that myself and others grew up in?
So I grew up in the United Methodist Church, and there are certainly parts of the denomination that are more steeped in conservative social values around sexuality. And for ordination candidates and folks who are, then who go into the ministry, you vow celibacy and singleness and fidelity in marriage. So it was important to me to get married before I was ordained. So that is sort of the line, but it's just not the focus of a large portion of the denomination's life. Like our focus growing up was on a whole lot of other things. And to some extent, then I think I was a lot more, theologically well-versed than biblically versed, maybe by the time I got to college. So, we did all the kinds of things that lots of church people, we went to worship every week and Sunday school and youth group, and we played and we learned and we did service projects and went on trips to the Boundary Waters every summer, and mission work trips in Appalachia. We did sort of all the church things. We just didn't really talk about sexuality a whole lot. There was one sex ed weekend that we did. I think probably I must have been in middle school. And I'm pretty sure my dad, who's a pastor, was one of the leaders. So the fact that I didn't die then is pretty impressive to me. So the emphasis, they did say that the curriculum that they used did talk about marriage as the best place for sex. It was not shame-based. There was no sort of talk really about a lot of it just wasn't the primary focus. The primary focus of that curriculum was about good decision making. And so there was also information about birth control and changing bodies and how do we make choices as Christian people. And if you're a Methodist, it's, scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. So so from very early on, there was this sense that there are a lot of voices in addition to, not a lot, but there are other voices in addition to scripture that inform how we think about sex. So that was one. In my family life, my mom had a second edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves. I was born in the very late 70s. And so the fact actually that I'm a little bit older, the purity movement, I think, didn't really hit its peak until maybe just when I was kind of out of high school. Right, yeah. So to some extent, I sort of missed it that way. And so my parents, they handed me a Your Changing Body book, which I read all of and learned, again, about making choices that feel good to you and feel wise and where you should go for help and wisdom when you need, when you have questions. And so that was, and then of course I grew up in Illinois, and the suburban high school where I went to, we had really good health class. It wasn't fantastic, but it was, the information was pretty accurate for straight kids. So I think it was just the fact that there was no overriding voice from the church talking about this and any singular Christian sexual ethic or any singular Christian sexual behavior pattern or restriction or prohibition or whatever. It was, the church was a defining voice in a lot of ways for me in terms of my identity, but not necessarily around sexuality, and mostly for better, I think.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because I had such a different experience where it was,
Yeah.
My parents didn't talk to me at all about it. And I think just kind of crossed their fingers and hoped I would learn, I guess, at church or at other places. But yeah, I mean, it was a very clear, like, this is the only way. And if you're having sex, then you're not a Christian if you're, a high school kid who's having sex. So at what point, you talk about in your book how you have friends kind of come to you and say, like, is it okay if I sleep with my boyfriend? And you're kind of like, sure. So at what point did you realize that kind of like people had this sort of diverged experience with Christianity?
There were kids who went to, there are certainly evangelical churches. We grew up in the shadow of Willow Creek, which is, one of the first big ones in the Midwest. And so there were kids who went there and certainly who were hearing that sex was something that was not to be had. Although it was funny, one of my boyfriends at the time tried to convince me that two of his friends were having sex and their girlfriends both went to that church. And I was kind of like, there's no way. So I think I must have known in the back of my mind that was not a thing at every church. But it's funny because a lot of my friends, I wouldn't say that we were late bloomers, but very much had a sense of not waiting because we were good girls or not waiting because we were Christians or whatever, but just because it wasn't right yet. So I think that I first became aware probably of Christian purity stuff in college, but really more from a religious studies way. I wrote a journalism paper article on one of the really conservative student Bible studies that I knew a girl who was in, and I went, and I remember being so indignant there. My article wasn't very good because I was not very journalistically objective. I was so mad because, they're like, when did you become a Christian? And I was like, I was raised in the Methodist Church. And they're like, no, but when did you become a Christian? I was like, no, anyway. So I was mad they doubted my authenticity. So, but yeah, I really started reading about stuff. And then I read some of Josh Harris's stuff when I was in grad school, and then did my graduate thesis on Christian sex ed stuff. And so looked more specifically at like the curriculum that was being used in various places at that point. Most of my friends, other than the one who called me, although this is sort of funny. So I don't want to confess that my book is inaccurate. However, when I wrote to that friend who I talk about in the introduction who called me asking for advice, I misplaced it. She didn't call until I was a first year seminary student. And, we were all already in graduate school. So even then asking for, sort of my blessing and wisdom in whether or not she should sleep with her boyfriend was significantly later. I mean, she was 21. So I guess part of my thought is that there's so much fear that like, if you give kids a comprehensive sex education and if you talk to them about their faith, giving them choices and discerning what is right and good in their lives, that they'll like immediately start, banging everybody they can. But that was not the experience of my friends. Like when my friends and I all started being sexually active in various degrees, it was pretty intentional, and it was later, right? So not all of them had glasses and were flat chested like me. I mean, some of them actually were like making choices. It wasn't just circumstantial.
Yeah, so for a long time, I read a lot of books by Christian authors about sex, and there wasn't anyone sort of coming on the record and saying, it's okay to have sex before marriage. It's not that big of a deal. And for years, I felt that way, but I was sort of like afraid to act on it. And it was really interesting the timing your book came out. And so I'm just curious, has there been that much backlash, or what's been the reaction to it?
Certainly from certain circles, there has been backlash. There are, I've gotten called lots of nice names on Facebook and in the comment section of the Washington Post. But in some ways it's a very, the book makes a very modest claim. And it's funny that you mentioned earlier that you liked the title, because it just drives me nuts, because I didn't want the book to be an argument. I wanted it to be, I just didn't want to ask the question or deal with the question of sort of like whether or not people should have sex before marriage. I just wanted to start at the fact that some people do. And so, but that doesn't mean that they can't ask ethical questions or think about what their faith has to say about their romantic relationships. I felt like so I wasn't so much making an argument for sex outside of marriage as just saying, let's take that as a given in some cases and talk about other things. What does lust look like? What does fidelity look like? What does appropriate intimacy look like? Because I felt like, because I've read I read all those books. I think it's so interesting because like I read, is it Real Sex? What's Lauren Winner's book?
Yeah, Real Sex, the Truth.
Yeah,
the naked truth about chastity.
And there's so much good stuff there. But I would just get so hung up about some of the other things. So I just I didn't want that to be the primary question. I also thought, because there were a whole lot of folks writing when those books, around the turn of the millennia, because there was Real Sex, and then there was a woman in California who had decided to, she converted to Christianity and took on Chastity, and Anna Broadway. Anyway, but, and then the Josh Harris books and things like that. And there was so much regret. That was so interesting to me.
Yeah.
So anyway, so there was some backlash, but I really do think that, there are also a lot of people who are having sex and would like to think about that. And it might be useful for them to think about that through the lens of faith and their relationship to God. And to be told that they just can't because they're sexually active is not all that helpful. And I'm a pastor, right? I'm concerned with like people's actual lived experiences.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that people almost hear it as like everyone should have sex before marriage, and it's like, well, no, like people should do what they need to do. But yeah, and I think a lot of people are, and just kind of aren't able to talk about it with their Christian friends. I've definitely seen that at church, where people sort of feel like it's something they can't talk about.
It's so funny too, because I don't know if this is just like a difference in circle, but most of my, like, I don't know if I have ever married a couple. Maybe once have I married a couple that wasn't living together.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So it's pretty clear that they're, and they come to me and they tell me that, so it's not like, but it's interesting because there's always this, I think they expect me to yell at them about it. So I'm like, what?
Because they're like me and they've heard, cohabitation will send you straight to divorce and blah, blah, blah. Right. Yeah.
And I do think, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, I do think it's interesting because you said, you're not saying that people have to have sex before marriage. I do think, though, that like one shouldn't marry without a pretty good understanding of one's own sexuality. That doesn't necessarily mean that you had to have like had sexual intercourse, but like, but I do think that you should like have done some self-examination both in an innuendo way and also in a like reflective, reflective way, because I do think that like, I've been married for how many years now? 12 years. And I do think that like sexual chemistry is important. Yeah. It's not the only thing, but like, I don't know. I think it matters.
Yeah. Yeah. Another book I read when I was pretty young I think it was called Best Friends for Life. And it really was just like, you're supposed to find someone who is your best friend and the sex thing will just work. And which is another really interesting thing in terms of like how I was raised. And it almost seemed like what I was taught was that God will provide this perfect husband for you if you just wait and trust God.
Right.
But then, as people who grew up in that purity culture of kind of like, late 20s, early 30s. And now I've been to churches where the pastor said something like, so many of you are single and you're like praying to find someone to marry, and like, well, maybe God just wants you to be single. Right. Which like, I understand, like I know there's that passage where Paul talks about, sometimes it's better, like you can serve God better if you're single or something like that. But so what's the way that you think about this and kind of like the theology of, does God want us to be married or does he want us to be happy, I guess?
Yeah, that's such a great, like, I would hope that God is ambivalent about whether or not we want to be married. But if we are married, wants us to be happy. No, and wants us to be happy no matter what. My biblical Greek is really terrible. But the Beatitudes, the word that is often translated, blessed are the, it's like makaroi. It can also be translated happy are those who. And so I think that it's interesting, that the idea of thinking of blessing as happiness. Anyway, that's sort of a side note. But yeah, no, I really object to a matchmaker god. The chapter that ended up being on singleness in the book, I rewrote like 6 times. And I started it with attempting to log on to Christian Mingle. Have you ever looked at Christian Mingle? So, I mean, there's the sense, and I can't even remember which psalm or proverb they quote, as their tagline, but it's, basically God has a perfect mate for you somewhere. And although the first question is like, how tall are you?
Oh, right.
Which I just think is amazing. I'm like, because that's the first thing, because if, you're a good Christian husband should probably be taller than you, but whatever. And then there's all this stuff about like, where do you go to church? Mm-hmm. So no, I don't think that I don't think there's one person I don't necessarily believe in soulmates, right? I think that like there's a whole, or people, like people who are predestined to be together. Now, part of that is because I don't necessarily believe in like predestination, right? I think that like my understanding of God has created us to be free, right? And hopefully, to choose God and, follow God. But so no, I believe that circumstances is really huge. I talk about, one of my friends who's been single forever, is a lawyer in New York, and she's brilliant and beautiful and, fun. She's single because there are like a lot of single women lawyers in New York and like not as many men. Right. So actually, I know another woman who is demographically also like the same age and beautiful and lovely, and a lawyer in New York who is also single. So, so I think that there's, I think that has a lot less to do with God and a lot more to do with like the population of New York.
Yeah, and definitely changing norms in our culture in general. I also lived in New York for a while and then tried dating there. And it's, and I was focused on my career too. And I think that was another thing that changed for me. It was sort of as I got older, it was like, well, does God want me to just not have this intimate part of, like, not have access to intimate relationships and just be cut off from that if I happen to be focused on my career? It just kind of didn't add up.
Yeah. And so that's right. It is true that like when you are in a relationship, it is time consuming, and rightly, right? Like you have to give time to build intimacy and partnership with another person. Like that's just how it goes. I wrote at one point in the book, like, I don't know if Josh, my husband, and I would have like fallen sort of so quickly into couplehood if it hadn't been summer when we got together and I was in grad school and he's a teacher, so he was off, and we just like spent a ton of time together. Like if I had been trying to do my homework, would we have like gotten married right away? So I do think, and now I have kids and I have no time to do anything, so I can't, so I like relationships are time consuming, and you can give more in certain ways to your work and to your friendships and to other projects if you don't have like primary responsibility for one or for other people, right? But and there's, that's why I think celibacy and the priesthood can work nicely, right? They can move the priest wherever they want because it doesn't, like, he doesn't have a wife. But in some ways, if you desire a partner and you feel called to like, that you would have both joy and be able to serve, God in the world while in a relationship, then I wouldn't think God would want you to be single.
Totally.
But yeah. And so then I'm working on another book now about providence, because I don't, I don't really know how it works. I don't want to say that God's not involved, but at the same time, and I don't want to say it's like blind luck that things work out for some people and not others. Or, just structural injustice. But at the same time, I don't want to say, oh yeah, well, like if God wanted you to have a partner, God would give you one. I don't think that's nonsense.
It's not that God doesn't care, but, So one line I loved from your book, which I've always also seen quoted a lot online: the call of the gospel is not to protect ourselves at all costs, but to risk ourselves in love. And I thought that was really interesting because one piece of pushback I get from other Christians about this is that sex bonds people so much, and which is a really wonderful thing in a relationship. And so then I guess the question is, can you bond with multiple people across your lifetime, or is that less of a bond if you have had that with more than one person?
Yeah, it's funny because I have mixed feelings about the claim that sex always bonds you to someone. It's like it's an intimate thing, obviously, and it binds you in the moment and probably for a while. But But I think humans are not just biological creatures, right? Like we're meaning making creatures. And so the way that we interpret and make meaning out of the things that we do and the relationships that we have is probably ultimately more powerful than the things we do on any one time. I mean, I do think sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's sort of like what the meaning you're giving to that. Like if you go in and you're like, one night stand, I'm not going to talk to this person again, and that's kind of like, you're not going to get the same experience out of that you are if you're like, this is my boyfriend, we're in love, kind of a thing.
Right. Like, I mean, right. And I don't know. I mean, maybe it's, I'm sorry, I'm laughing. My only real attempt at a one night stand, I'm married. I mean,
not a good example for that.
But I mean, we had known each other for a long time, but so I don't know if it's. So I guess what I mean to say is, I was always like a serial monogamist. I did not date a whole lot. We got married when I was 25. We had been together since I was 23. So in some ways, I am not the right example to talk about that. But I do know that like we are fully committed and capable of being together, despite the fact that we both had other sexual partners. I can't even. Right. I think I talk about this. There's a chapter on history. And I can't even remember what it was like to be with someone else. Like the idea of that is so foreign to me now. Sex is sex with my husband, for me, right? So I don't think that. Also, I mean, in what other way are we told that, like, I mean, where else in the Christian story are we told that love is something that like gets smaller if you give it away? Right. Like that's so counter.
It's like with having kids. It's like you don't love the second one less than the first one.
There's a great line. Heidi Newmark is a wonderful Lutheran pastor and writer, and her first memoir, Breathing Space, is about the church she pastored for a number of years in Queens, and she has this line in that book. Where she's talking with her kids when they are small about love. And one of them says, basically, how is it that you can love? Oh, she says goodnight to one of them and, says, I love you with all my heart. And she says to the other one, I love you with all my heart. And the kids are like, well, how can that be? And she goes, well, that's the way it is with love. It's a miracle, and she says it in this more beautiful kind of way, but that's the thing with love. It's a miracle, right? It's so odd to me that in some ways, segments of Christianity, particularly in America, treat sex as so different from the rest of human and Christian life,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess what I'm looking for as a pastor and someone interested in theology is like something that is consistent for people,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of my next question, because I think you talk about this in your book too, is, how do people make good decisions? Especially, it's almost easier to be like, oh, black and white rule, just wait till you're married and everything's fine. But how do you decide what experiences are going to be positive and fulfilling?
I do think that we have a 10-year-old and who's just started walking to school by herself and walking home from school with either herself or her sister sometimes. And pretty much the day that we decided that she could do that, we got like an email, the whole district from the school superintendent about, how a suspicious, person in a van tried to like get a kid to come in the van with, and we're like, oh, great. Right. Okay. So we were talking and, but we're like, we're going to keep sending her out. So we ended up having this conversation at dinner the other night, though, just last night, about, if anything like that ever were to happen, what you could do. But our kid is like pretty anxious, right? So of course I'm trying to reassure her that that's never going to happen. She doesn't have to worry about it. But my husband says to her, you can trust the feeling in your gut, right? You can trust, if you feel scared or you feel uncomfortable, just leave. Like you have to trust that. And so to me, I mean, I think that's really imperative. Obviously not just in the situation of being 10 and walking home from school, but I think in a relationship or in any encounter, you have to sort of trust your gut. And it's funny for me to say that because I can barely make decisions about like where I should eat lunch without a committee of people, and my boyfriend in college used to make fun of me for making all my decisions by committee. But actually, maybe that's part of it too. I mean, trusting your gut gut, having like wise and loving, people who love you to help you make important decisions, listening certainly for the voice of God through scripture and through the church, but I think holding all those together in discernment, I think, is probably pretty important. All of those things. And again, knowing yourself. I mean, that's the gut thing, right? Knowing what's good for you. I mean, there are certain people, I am not, I write about this, I think there's a chapter called Naked, about vulnerability. And for some people, they feel stripped bare and like really seen by, people knowing a certain piece of information about them, or seeing something or whatever. And for different people, like kissing is the biggest intimacy, and oh my God, and for some people intercourse is, and for some people like oral sex, even if they never do that, so I think people have different degrees of like what they're comfortable with. And I think knowing what yours are and weighing, part of appropriate vulnerability is knowing what you can risk in any given situation. Like how much of your heart, how much of your body, like how much do I trust this for this? And to some extent that works in the purity model, right? I mean, because they're saying you're risking everything by having sex, and you can't risk everything unless you have the like stability of marriage to protect it. Right. And I just don't think that it's so black and white as that, for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I like that you mentioned vulnerability, because I think that was kind of a newsflash for me, was that in order to have intimacy, you have to have vulnerability. And so there is a chance that you could get hurt. And that doesn't mean that it was a mistake to have feelings for someone or to spend time with them.
Yeah. I mean, right. You get right. Better than to loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Yeah. I mean, heartbreak happens. I have definitely had my heart broken. That's okay. It happens.
Yeah.
It's,
part of life.
It's part of life. And you can't, and I think that's the thing. You can't avoid that. You can't avoid it. So, yeah. So, I mean, the whole, I do a lot of like parenting stuff now, both in my work and because I am a parent, but the whole big buzzword right now is about resilience, right? That it's not that we can protect kids from hardship. We don't want them to be, snowflakes who melt at the slightest word of criticism, but we want them to be able to like face challenges and carry on. We want them to like know what to do when they make a mistake or when something doesn't go the way they thought it would, and that's true in our romantic lives too, right? Like things don't always go the way we think they will, and we need to know how to keep going.
Totally. Yeah. And so I think it's so great that your book is out there, because it gives people a way to talk about this and a way to talk to, their Christian friends and family about it. Because I know, there's kind of a situation where you get older and you might go on an overnight trip with someone you're dating, or you bring them home for the holidays and you're kind of like, we, just share my bed at my home. And it kind of it's forced to talk about it with your family. Do you have any tips for how to kind of approach that, especially if your family might feel differently on this topic?
That's interesting. I think the first time that Josh and I shared a bed in my parents' house, we were already living together and engaged. So, and I'm pretty sure I didn't ever spend the night with anyone else in their home, mostly because I've always lived near them, except for when I was in college. So, but I think talking about sex with your parents is terrible, right? Like, so if you can possibly avoid any conversation, I would just do it. If it's just for a weekend, like whatever. If they want to press the point, I don't always think that things are left better unsaid, but when it's like the status of my sex life, that's fine. My parents know that I have 3 children. And that is sufficient. So to some extent, I think that like if you're in someone's home, then like whatever, respecting the boundaries of their hospitality is like part of being a good guest, right? I mean,
right.
Methodists don't drink in their retreat centers, though I drink. So like I don't drink at the retreat center, right? So that's I think that's just like being a good guest. But I don't know. I mean, I think part of this is like, I mean, again, it's that bigger question. Like, how do you help your parents to see that like you're your own person and that like you love them and are discerning something different? And I mean, I don't know. I think that Diana Anderson, do you know her?
Yeah.
I don't know her in person. But I read Damaged Goods, and she talks about like having that conversation with her mother and sort of like coming out to her, and I think she's queer or bi, but basically talking to her mom about having sex, and it was not as I mean, she was, I am like astounded. I feel like she was so brave, but at the same time, it was like better than she thought. So maybe in some ways it's the same as any kind of intimacy, right? Like figuring out what you can stand to lose and what's at stake. You know, I mean, like if you depend on your parents financially and they're going to like stop helping you because they find out you're having sex, then like probably don't have that conversation with them, or ever push it. Right. But like, but if they ask, and you know, I think the other thing though too is that like, particularly the farther you are into adulthood, I mean, I don't know. I think parents like tell you more stuff, right? And you can start to see them as people. And it is, I mean, also people, like big majorities of the population have had sex outside of marriage for years and years and years and years. So like, I mean, part of the reason that I didn't anticipate my parents flipping out when I moved in with my boyfriend was because they lived together before they were married. You know? I mean, like the first gay people I knew like were not my friends, but like my parents' friends. So I mean, I think that like in some ways being aware of the history and like that there's, you know, in some ways nothing new under the sun, right? I mean, it may be that when you're open about your experiences, they feel like they could be more open too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's kind of like you have this chance of greater intimacy with your family by being open about it.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, like, I do hope that like most parents just want us to be happy and healthy. So like, if they know that like, this is not a ruinous thing, you know, then that could be reassuring for them.
Yeah, totally. So last question, what do you think is the most important thing that someone should know before maybe getting into an intimate relationship for the first time?
I think you should really like know each other, whether, you know, and be able to like know yourself and know how to like read the other person. And I think go slow too. I talk about this in the book, but it's like a continual pet peeve for me is, you know, like when teen sexuality is shown on, you know, on TV shows or whatever, you know, Dawson's Creek, there's always like two closed mouth kisses, and then like he tentatively puts his hand on her chest outside her shirt, and then they're having the question of whether or not they're going to have sex, and it's like that is not how this should go, right? Like there can be lots of time for build up, there can be lots of time for like increasing levels of intimacy, you know. There's no rush, right? Also, you should definitely have as safe of sex as possible. Either, you know, make sure that everybody has a clean bill of health, or like use condoms and dental dams and, you know, and then maybe backup birth control if you're straight and having intercourse. But I think like, you know, while I think we're supposed to risk ourselves in love, I don't think we're supposed to risk ourselves unnecessarily, right? So like if someone is not respectful of you or isn't caring or kind or won't listen if you've reached an unanticipated boundary within yourself, you know, like then that's not the right thing. So those are the kinds of things that I would recommend people think about. And then also, you know, this is supposed to be fun, right? And life-giving. So if it doesn't feel fun and life-giving, then, you know, don't. But if it does,
then don't.
You know, but if it does, then, you know, it might be worth exploring.
Yeah, it's kind of like they go with your gut.
Yeah.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Bromleigh.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for True Love, No Shame. Be sure to check out Bromleigh's book, Good Christian Sex, and we'll be back soon with more.